Sacramento, California, a city known for its long, hot summers and its old money charm. In the 1980s, the neighborhood around F Street still carried the faded elegance of a time when wealthy Californians would vacation in its grand Victorian homes. By the end of the decade, many of those homes had fallen into disrepair. Boarded-up windows, overgrown lawns, silence where there was once laughter. But at 1426 F Street, one house stood apart. It was a two-story Victorian, painted white and blue, with a wrought iron fence running along the front. Christmas lights decorated the porch, lace curtains hung neatly in every window, and in the front yard, a small statue of St. Francis of Assisi watched over a garden that was always in bloom. The woman who lived here was named Dorothea Puente. To the people of Sacramento, she was something close to a saint. She hosted Alcoholics Anonymous meetings for people trying to get sober. She helped homeless men and women sign up for Social Security benefits. She funded scholarships. She donated to charities. She gave money to local radio programs serving the Hispanic community. She took in stray cats and fed them from her kitchen. When neighbors saw her on the street, they saw a stout, white-haired grandmother in vintage clothing and oversized glasses. She smiled at everyone. She shared food during the holidays. Local politicians knew her by name. Social workers trusted her so completely that they sent some of Sacramento's most vulnerable people, the elderly, the mentally ill, the addicted, to live in her boarding house, believing they would be safe under her care. 19 people were placed in Dorothea Puente's boarding house by Sacramento's social services. She accepted the clients no other care home would take, the difficult ones, the ones society had already given up on, and for that, she was celebrated. But in the fall of 1988, the neighbors on F Street started noticing something they couldn't explain. A smell. Faint at first, then overpowering. It was coming from Dorothea's garden. The stench was so severe that neighbors had to shut their windows and turn off their air conditioning units, because the systems pulled the odor directly into their homes. Several of them confronted Dorothea about it. She always had an answer. She told one neighbor the smell was from the sewer line. She told another it was dead rats decaying under the floorboards. She told a third it was fish-based fertilizer she was using in her garden. Neighbors would see her outside, spreading lime powder across the soil or planting new seeds. Indoors, guests at the boarding house noticed her spraying air freshener in the living room throughout the day, sometimes every few minutes, but the smell always came back. It hung in the air like something alive. No one questioned her, not really, because who would suspect a grandmother? Who would look at a woman with white hair and a warm smile, a woman who gave to charity and helped the homeless, and think that something terrible was growing beneath her rose bushes? The smell that drifted from 1426 F Street was not sewage, it was not dead rats, and it was not fertilizer. It was the smell of human remains, decomposing bodies buried just inches below the surface of Dorothea Puente's carefully tended garden. This is the story of how a woman who looked like everyone's grandmother became one of America's most calculating serial killers, and how an entire city refused to see what was right in front of them. In the first week of November 1988, a social worker named Judy Moyes picked up her phone and dialed a number she had called many times before, the boarding house at 1426 F Street. Judy was checking on one of her clients, a 51-year-old man named Alvaro Montoya, known to most people as Bert. Bert suffered from schizophrenia. He often talked to himself. He had no contact with his family. The state of California had placed him in Dorothea Puente's boarding house earlier that year, in February of 1988, because it was considered one of the best care homes in Sacramento. Bert had grown attached to Dorothea. He called her Mama. But when Judy called to check on him, Dorothea told her something unexpected. She said Bert had left. A relative had come to the house and taken him to Mexico to be with his family. Judy was suspicious. In all the months she had worked with Bert, he had never once mentioned any family. And Dorothea's story kept shifting. First, it was Mexico. Then it was Utah. The details didn't add up. Then, something even more unusual happened. A man called Judy's office, claiming to be Bert's brother-in-law, a man named Michel Obergoni. He said he had picked Bert up from the boarding house. But in a critical slip, the caller introduced himself first as Don Anthony before quickly correcting the name. It was a mistake that immediately deepened Judy's suspicions. A few days later, a letter arrived at the social services office, supposedly from Michel Obergone, confirming Bert's whereabouts. But the letter was wrapped in a paper towel. Investigators would later suspect the towel was used to avoid leaving fingerprints. For Judy Moise, this was the breaking point. She called the Sacramento Police Department and filed a missing persons report. On November 7, 1988, Officer Richard Ewing was dispatched to 1426 F Street. When he arrived, Dorothea greeted him warmly. She was cooperative and calm. She repeated her story about Bert leaving with a relative. The other residents of the boarding house, all of them elderly, some disabled, some struggling with addiction, confirmed her account. But Judy Moise had specifically told Officer Ewing to speak with one resident in particular, a 64-year-old retired cook named John Sharp. Unlike the other tenants, Sharp was neither an alcoholic nor mentally impaired. He was coherent, he was observant, and he was terrified. In Dorothea's presence, Sharp told the officer the same story everyone else had, that Bert had left with family. But as the officer turned to leave, Sharp did something extraordinary. He caught up with Ewing outside the house and pressed a handwritten note into his hand. It was scribbled on the back of an envelope. 5 words. "She wants me to lie to you." Sharp asked Ewing to meet him privately, away from the boarding house. When they met later, Sharp's account was deeply unsettling. He told the officer that Dorothea had instructed all the tenants to repeat the story about Bert's relative. But it wasn't true. Sharp didn't know what had happened to Bert, but he knew that Dorothea was lying. And there was more. Sharp described hearing a loud thump on the night Benjamin Fink, another tenant, had supposedly moved out of the boarding house. After the thump, he heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. In the days that followed, a foul odor emanated from Fink's upstairs room. When Sharp asked Dorothea about the smell, she told him it was a sewer backup. Sharp also told police that Dorothea had hired men, including prisoners on work furlough, to dig large holes in the backyard. Some of those holes had later been filled with concrete. Officer Ewing had heard enough. He contacted Detective Sergeant John Cabrera of the Sacramento Police Department's Missing Persons and Homicide Bureau. Cabrera pulled Dorothea Puente's background. What he found stunned him. First, Dorothea had lied about her age. Her documents listed her as being in her early 60s, but she was actually 59. More importantly, Dorothea Puente was on federal parole. She had been convicted in 1982 of drugging and robbing elderly victims. One of the conditions of her parole was clear. She was specifically forbidden from running a boarding house or having any contact with elderly people. She had been violating that condition for years, and no one had caught it. Her parole officers had visited her 15 times over 2 years and never realized the house was functioning as a care facility for the very people she was prohibited from being around. On the morning of November 11th, 1988, a Friday, Detective John Cabrera, along with Detective Terry Brown and federal probation agent Jim Wilson, arrived at 1426 F Street. They did not have a warrant. They didn't need one. When they knocked, Dorothea opened the door with the same warm smile she showed everyone. She invited them inside without hesitation. Cabrera would later say he was taken aback. The house was clean, cozy, and meticulously decorated. Porcelain dolls, flower vases on every table, decorative napkins folded neatly on the furniture. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like, a kind old woman's home. Dorothea admitted freely that she was in violation of her parole by running the boarding house. She was cooperative. She was pleasant. She even provided the detectives with a shovel. Cabrera and his team walked to the southeast corner of the backyard. The soil there looked recently disturbed. Cabrera picked up the shovel and started digging. 30 minutes later, his shovel blade hit something. Fabric. Then, what appeared to be dried tissue. Cabrera climbed into the shallow pit and pulled at what he initially thought was a tree root. It was not a root, it was a human bone. The discovery sent a jolt through the entire team. Cabrera immediately called the coroner's office. The decision was made to halt digging until a full forensic team could arrive the following morning with proper equipment. The property was placed under 24-hour surveillance. At this point, Dorothea Puente was not yet a formal suspect. She was not under arrest. She was inside the house, watching. Saturday morning. The sun had barely risen over Sacramento when a convoy of vehicles pulled up to 1426 F Street. A forensic anthropology team from Sacramento State University, officers from the medical examiner's office, the county's forensic unit. They brought heavy excavation equipment and enough supplies for what they expected would be a long day. They were right. The partial remains discovered the previous day were fully exhumed first. The body appeared to be that of an elderly woman. Decomposed white hair was still attached to the remains. This was the body of 78-year-old Leona Carpenter, who had been placed in Dorothea's care in December of 1986 after being discharged from a hospital. She had vanished by February of 1987. No one had come looking for her. As the forensic team continued digging, word spread through the neighborhood. Reporters from the Los Angeles Times, the Sacramento Bee, and local television stations arrived and surrounded the property. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, children climbed nearby trees to watch the police work. The quiet street had become a crime scene. And then they found more. A second body. Then a third, beneath a concrete slab near the rose bushes. A fourth, under a gazebo in the backyard. By the end of the weekend, a total of 7 bodies had been pulled from the earth behind Dorothea Puente's boarding house. 7 human beings buried in a backyard so small that investigators were astonished she had managed to fit them all without a single witness. The crowd that had been whispering fell into a terrible silence. Television cameras broadcast the scene across California and then across the nation. Sacramento was in shock. The grandmother of F Street was at the center of the most horrifying discovery the city had ever seen. But in the middle of this chaos, while bodies were being unearthed from her garden, Dorothea Puente did something that would define her story forever. She walked up to Detective John Cabrera, calm and composed, and made a simple request. She asked if she could walk to the Clarion Hotel just across the street to have a cup of coffee. Cabrera looked at her. She was a 59-year-old woman in a housecoat. She was not under arrest. There was, as yet, no definitive evidence linking her directly to the deaths. He said yes. He walked partway with her and one of her boarders, a man named John McCauley. Once they reached the edge of the crowd, Cabrera stopped and watched them continue toward the hotel. Then he turned back. He picked up a shovel and resumed digging. 21 minutes later, he would remember the time precisely. He unearthed a second body. Officers immediately rushed to the Clarion Hotel to detain Dorothea, but she was not there. She had never gone for coffee. Instead of walking to the hotel, Dorothea Puente had gone directly to a taxi stand. She took a cab to one of her favorite bars in Sacramento, where she drank 4 glasses of vodka with grape juice. From there, she took another taxi to Stockton, about an hour east. In Stockton, she boarded a Greyhound bus bound for Los Angeles, a 6-hour journey. She had $3,000 in her purse. She had a plan, and she had no intention of coming back. When Cabrera received the news, the feeling was devastating. He later described it as though someone had pulled his insides out. The woman who had smiled at him, who had offered him a shovel to dig up her own garden, who had stood on the porch watching forensic teams unearth the dead, she had manipulated a seasoned homicide detective into letting her walk away from a mass grave. On November 13, 1988, the Sacramento Police Department issued an all-points bulletin for Dorothea Puente. Her photograph was broadcast on every major news network. A citywide, then statewide, then national manhunt was underway. Meanwhile, back at 1426 F Street, the full scope of what lay beneath the garden was becoming clear. 7 bodies, all former tenants, all people who had been placed in Dorothea's care, all people who had been forgotten by the world long before they were buried in her yard. Dorothea Puente was gone. She was somewhere between Sacramento and Los Angeles, riding a bus with $3,000 and a lifetime of practiced lies. Behind her, she left 7 graves, an entire city in disbelief, and one question that no one could answer. How did no one see this coming? While Dorothea Puente was on the run and her whereabouts remained unknown, investigators and journalists in Sacramento began doing something that should have been done years earlier. They started looking into who Dorothea Puente really was. What they found was a life built almost entirely on lies. A woman who had been rehearsing the role of the perfect grandmother for nearly 5 decades. Dorothea Helen Gray was born on January 9, 1929, in Redlands, California. Her parents, Jesse James Gray and Trudy Mae Yates, were both alcoholics. Her father was a violent man who, in fits of drunken despair, would hold a gun to his own head in front of his children and threaten to pull the trigger. Reports vary on the exact number of siblings Dorothea had. Most accounts say 6 or 7. She was the 6th child in a household defined by poverty, chaos, and terror. In 1937, when Dorothea was 8 years old, her father died of tuberculosis. 1 year later, her mother, who had turned to sex work to survive, lost custody of all her children. Before the year was out, Trudy Mae was dead, killed in a motorcycle accident. In the span of 12 months, Dorothea had lost both parents. She and her siblings were sent to an orphanage. Dorothea would later tell people that during her time there, she was sexually abused. She never elaborated on the details, but what is known is that from this point forward, Dorothea Gray began to disappear, and new versions of her began to emerge. Census records show that at the age of 13, Dorothea was living with a foster family in Napa, California. By 16, school records place her in Los Angeles. Within a year, she had moved again, this time to Olympia, Washington, where locals knew her not as Dorothea Gray, but by the nickname Sherry. In Olympia, the teenage Dorothea worked at a milkshake shop and shared a motel room with a friend. It was during this period, according to later investigation, that she also began working as a sex worker. She was 16 years old. It was also in Olympia, in the summer of 1945, that she met 22-year-old Fred McFall, a soldier who had just returned from the Pacific theater of World War II. In a later interview, Fred recalled that Dorothea was aware of her own beauty and knew exactly how to use it to get what she wanted. They married in Reno, Nevada, a few months later. On the marriage certificate, Dorothea listed her age as 30 and her name as Sherrianne A. Rissell. Both were lies. She was 16. This was the first documented instance of what would become Dorothea's defining trait. She did not simply lie when it was convenient. She constructed entirely new identities. She inhabited them. She became them. And when one identity no longer served her, she shed it like old skin and built another. Fred McFall was the first person close to her who recognized the pattern. He noticed that Dorothea spent every dollar they had on expensive clothing. She invented elaborate stories about her past, tales designed to make her seem more interesting, more important, more sympathetic. She told people she had participated in the Bataan Death March during the war, one of the most brutal forced marches in military history, where thousands of American and Filipino prisoners died from heat, disease, and execution. She claimed she had survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. She said she was the sister of a Swedish ambassador. She told people she was a close personal friend of the actress Rita Hayworth. None of it was true, not a single word. But here is what made Dorothea dangerous. The people around her knew the stories were exaggerated, perhaps even fabricated. They talked about it among themselves, but no one confronted her. No one took it seriously. They simply saw it as the harmless eccentricity of a woman who liked to embellish. Between 1946 and 1948, Dorothea and Fred had two daughters in Gardnerville, Nevada. Within months of the second daughter's birth, Dorothea left for Los Angeles. She placed one daughter with Fred's mother. The other was given up for adoption. She also became pregnant again and chose to terminate the pregnancy. By 1948, the family she had built was gone. That same year, she was arrested in Riverside, California, for purchasing women's accessories, a hat, a purse, stockings, and shoes, using forged checks. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of forgery and was sentenced to 4 months in jail. While she was incarcerated, Fred left her for good. Upon her release, she was given 3 years of probation. She violated it almost immediately by fleeing the area. In 1952, she married a merchant seaman named Axel Bren Johansson in San Francisco. This marriage introduced her most elaborate fabrication yet. She reinvented herself as Thea Singawala Nayarda, claiming to be a Muslim woman of Egyptian and Israeli descent. Whenever Axel shipped out to sea, Dorothea invited other men into the home and gambled away his earnings. In 1960, Sacramento police arrested her for operating a bookkeeping firm that was actually a front for a brothel. She was convicted and sentenced to 90 days in the Sacramento County Jail. 1 year later, after a binge of drinking, lying, and erratic behavior that included a suicide attempt, Axel had her committed to the DeWitt State Hospital. The doctors there diagnosed her with 2 things. She was a pathological liar, and her personality was fundamentally unstable. The marriage ended in 1966. After the divorce, Dorothea adopted a new identity, Sharon Johansson. She presented herself as a devout Christian and established a reputation as a caregiver, offering shelter to young women escaping poverty and abuse. It was a calculated reinvention. Every persona she had worn before was a rehearsal. She was learning, through trial and error, which mask worked best. In 1968, at the age of 39, she married 21-year-old Roberto Jose Puente. The marriage lasted just 16 months before collapsing amid allegations of domestic abuse. Roberto fled to Mexico, and the divorce was not finalized until 1973. In 1975, Dorothea filed a restraining order against him. She never saw him again, but she kept his name, Puente. It would be the name she carried for the rest of her life. And then, Dorothea Puente found the role she had been preparing for her entire life. She became a grandmother, not a real grandmother, a performance of one. She let her hair go gray. She wore vintage clothing and large glasses. She carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had lived a long and respectable life. She began running a boarding house near 15th and F Streets in Sacramento, a home for people who had nowhere else to go. She hosted Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. She helped people sign up for government benefits. She funded local charities and scholarships. It was the most convincing identity she had ever created, because it was the one nobody would ever think to question. In 1978, the mask slipped briefly. She was convicted of illegally cashing 34 government checks belonging to her tenants and was sentenced to 5 years of probation. But even this conviction did not stop her. In January of 1982, she met a 74-year-old man named Malcolm McKenzie in a bar. She drugged his drink, and while he was incapacitated, she robbed him of a coin collection, watches, jewelry, and a diamond ring that had belonged to his mother. 4 months later, in April of 1982, 61-year-old Ruth Monroe, a friend and business partner of Dorothea's, was found dead in the boarding house from a massive overdose of codeine. Ruth had reportedly been in good health when she arrived. Just 3 days before her death, she told a friend she felt so sick she thought she was going to die. Her death was initially ruled an undetermined overdose. It would not be reclassified as a homicide until years later, after the bodies were found. Ruth Monroe's son, Bill Clausen, later said that if his mother's death had been properly investigated in 1982, the murders that followed might never have happened. He was probably right. Instead, the system let Dorothea continue. She was convicted of drugging and robbing 4 elderly people and sentenced to 5 years in prison. She served 3. She was released in 1985 on one condition. She was to have no contact with elderly persons, and she was absolutely forbidden from running a boarding house. Within weeks of her release, she was doing both. Before we continue, it is important to say something that often gets lost in stories like this. The people buried in Dorothea Puente's backyard were not statistics. They were not footnotes. They were human beings with histories, with memories, with people who once loved them. Some of them had fallen through every crack in the system. Some had been abandoned by their own families. All of them, at some point, trusted a woman who promised to take care of them. This is who they were. The first victim connected to the boarding house was Everson Theodore Gilmouth. He was 77 years old, a retiree from Oregon. He began writing to Dorothea while she was still in prison in 1985. When she was released that September, Gilmouth was waiting for her. He drove her home in his truck. They moved into the boarding house together. Dorothea wrote to his sister telling her they were getting married. Within weeks, Everson vanished. Dorothea hired a handyman named Ismael Carrasco Flores to build a wooden storage box, 6 feet long, 30 inches wide, 30 inches deep. She paid him $800 and gave him Everson's red Ford pickup truck as additional payment. The day after Flores finished the box, he noticed it had been nailed shut. Dorothea asked him to help her move it, saying it contained books and junk she wanted to dispose of. Flores drove the box about an hour from Sacramento and dumped it alongside the Sacramento River. On New Year's Day, 1986, a fisherman discovered the box. Inside was a severely decomposed body wrapped in plastic bags and a bedsheet secured with electrical tape. Mothballs and toilet deodorizer had been placed inside to mask the smell. The body would remain unidentified for nearly 3 years, until December of 1988, after the F Street excavation, when it was finally confirmed as Everson Gilmouth. For those 3 years, Dorothea mailed forged letters and cards to Everson's family, pretending he was alive. She forged his signature on his truck's title. She cashed his benefit checks until July of 1986. His family never suspected a thing. Betty Mae Palmer was 78 years old when she arrived at the boarding house in the fall of 1986. On October 14th of that year, Dorothea walked into a government office and obtained a California identification card bearing her own photograph, but Betty's name. 2 months later, she changed the mailing address on Betty's Social Security checks to 1426 F Street. Over the following months, she forged Betty's signature and cashed nearly $7,000 in benefit checks. Betty's body was found in the front yard, buried in a shallow hole beneath the statue of St. Francis of Assisi. She was wearing a white nightgown. Her head, her hands, and her lower legs had been removed and were never recovered. Toxicology reports detected doxylaminon, an over-the-counter antihistamine, along with haloperidol and flurazepam, prescription medications that had been previously prescribed to Betty. Her body was not positively identified until January of 1989 through comparison with prior medical X-rays. Leona Carpenter was also 78. In October of 1986, while Leona was hospitalized after a fluorazepam overdose, Dorothea summoned a notary to the hospital room and obtained power of attorney over her. She began cashing Leona's Social Security checks just 10 days later. Leona was discharged in December and sent to live at the boarding house. She returned to the hospital once more, and then, a few weeks after her second discharge in February of 1987, she disappeared. Her body was the first one that Detective John Cabrera pulled from the earth on November 11, 1988. Toxicology testing of her brain tissue revealed codeine, diazepam, and flurazepam. James Gallup was 62. He moved into the boarding house in February of 1987, recovering from heart valve surgery and a brain tumor operation. In July of that year, doctors found a potentially malignant tumor in his colon and scheduled further testing. Dorothea contacted the doctor's office and told them James had left for Los Angeles indefinitely. He never made it to that appointment. His body was found buried beneath a gazebo in the backyard. His brain and liver contained amitriptyline, nortriptyline, phenytoin, and flurazepam. A fellow tenant named Carol Durning later testified that James had told her Dorothea was giving him medication that made him sleep for unusually long periods. He was concerned about it. He mentioned it to someone who could listen, but no one acted on it. Vera Faye Martin was 61 years old when she was placed in Dorothea's care on October 2, 1987. Just 3 days after her arrival, Dorothea began forging Vera's Social Security checks. Over the following months, she stole more than $7,000 from her. Vera had always been close to her daughter. Every year, without fail, she called her daughter on her birthday. On October 19, 1987, for the first time that call did not come. Her daughter waited. The phone never rang. Vera had vanished. Vera's body was found under a metal shed in the backyard, sealed inside a metal box. When forensic investigators opened the container, they discovered something that would haunt everyone who worked the case. Vera Faye Martin was still wearing her wristwatch, and the watch was still ticking. Patterns in the soil around her body suggested she may have attempted to move, to claw at the earth surrounding her. Investigators could not definitively confirm whether she had been buried alive, but the evidence pointed in a direction that no one wanted to consider. Dorothy Miller was 65, a Native American woman with a history of alcohol dependency. She was placed in Dorothea's upstairs flat in October of 1987. A social worker saw her for the last time sitting on the front porch, smoking a cigarette. Weeks later, she was gone. In November of 1987, Dorothea hired a carpet cleaner to remove a large pile of what was described as foul-smelling slime from Dorothy's room. Dorothea forged Dorothy's checks for more than $11,000, the largest sum stolen from any single victim. Her body was found beneath a concrete slab near the rose bushes. When investigators recovered her remains, her hands were bound to her chest with duct tape. Toxicology reports found carbamazepine and flurazepam in her brain tissue. Benjamin Fink was 55. He arrived at the boarding house in March of 1988. He was an alcoholic in poor health. His brother visited him weekly for 6 weeks. Then, at the end of April, Dorothea told the brother that Benjamin had moved away. Another tenant reported a terrible smell coming from Benjamin's room. Dorothea told him it was a sewer backup. On April 29th, she ordered 12 bags of cement. That June, she had a hole dug near the metal shed in the backyard, which was later filled with concrete. Benjamin's body was found inside that concrete, wrapped in a plastic bedspread that had been knotted shut and secured with duct tape, covered with blue absorbent pads. His toxicology report showed amitriptyline, loxapine, and flurazepam, and finally, Alvaro Montoya, Bert, the man whose disappearance started it all. He was 51 years old. He had schizophrenia. He talked to himself. He had no contact with his family. He was placed in Dorothea's care in February of 1988 by a social worker named Judy Moyse, who believed the boarding house was one of the best in Sacramento. Bert called Dorothea Mama. Within 1 month of his arrival, an application was filed designating Dorothea as the payee of his benefits. At the end of August, another tenant saw someone removing Bert's clothes from his closet. Bert was last seen on August 24th. He missed a scheduled appointment on August 29th, and then he was gone. His body was the last to be identified, found buried adjacent to Leona Carpenter's remains. Toxicology testing revealed loxapine, flurazepam, diphenhydramine, amitriptyline, and carbamazepine. He had prescriptions for all of those drugs except carbamazepine. Someone had added it to his regimen without medical authorization. 9 people in total were connected to Dorothea Puente's boarding house. 7 buried in her backyard, 1 in the Sacramento River. 1 ruled an overdose for years before being reclassified as homicide. Every single one of them was someone the world had stopped paying attention to, and Dorothea knew it. She chose her victims not by proximity or opportunity, but by invisibility. She targeted people who would not be missed. When the bodies were pulled from Dorothea Puente's garden, the city of Sacramento did not just discover a serial killer, it discovered its own failure. Because Dorothea Puente did not operate in the shadows. She operated in the full light of day, surrounded by social workers, parole officers, government agencies, and neighbors, all of whom had the information they needed to stop her. None of them did. Let us begin with parole. After her 1982 conviction for drugging and robbing elderly victims, Dorothea was sentenced to 5 years in prison. She served 3 and was released in September of 1985. The conditions of her parole were explicit. She was forbidden from running a boarding house, and she was forbidden from having contact with elderly people. Over the next 2 years, her parole officers visited her 15 times. 15 visits. In a house that was clearly, visibly, unmistakably functioning as a boarding house for elderly and disabled tenants. 15 times, a parole officer walked into 1426 F Street, saw elderly residents living under Dorothea's roof, and left without raising a single red flag. How is that possible? The answer is the same answer that runs through every chapter of this story. They saw the grandmother. They saw the lace curtains and the porcelain dolls and the warm smile. And they made the same mistake everyone made. They assumed that what they were seeing was real. Then there was social services. Sacramento County's Social Services Department was responsible for placing vulnerable adults in appropriate care settings. They sent 19 people to Dorothea Puente's boarding house. 19 human beings entrusted to a woman who, at the time of their placement, was a convicted felon on parole for drugging and stealing from the elderly. They never ran a background check. They never verified her credentials. They never investigated her criminal history. They took her at face value, a kind, grandmotherly woman who was willing to take in the clients nobody else wanted, the difficult cases, the alcoholics, the people with severe mental illness, the ones who were aggressive or unstable. Other care facilities turned these people away. Dorothea accepted them, and the system was grateful. Grateful enough not to ask questions. A social worker named Peggy Nickerson later revealed that she had personally stopped sending clients to the boarding house after she witnessed Dorothea verbally abusing one of her tenants. But by the time Peggy made that decision, at least 4 of the people she had previously referred to the home were already buried in the backyard. When the story broke, a local news agency in Sacramento published an investigative report that named not just the Sacramento Police Department, but 10 other government and private agencies whose oversight failures had allowed the boarding house to operate unchecked. The report detailed how information about Dorothea's criminal past existed in multiple databases across multiple agencies, but none of those agencies communicated with each other. The police knew about her record, parole knew about her conditions, social services knew about the boarding house, But no one connected the dots. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Sacramento residents demanded to know how a convicted felon on parole for elder abuse had been allowed to run a home full of vulnerable people for years. How she had been visited repeatedly by parole officers who somehow failed to notice the obvious. How social workers had continued to send clients to her door without ever checking whether the woman caring for them had a criminal history. But there was another layer to the failure, one that is harder to talk about. The neighbors. The people on F Street smelled the decomposition for months. They complained to each other about it. They confronted Dorothea, and she gave them explanations that were, by any reasonable standard, absurd. Fish fertilizer, dead rats under the floorboards, a sewer line that never got fixed. For months, the stench of death lingered in the air of a residential neighborhood, and everyone accepted the excuses of one woman because she seemed kind. A retired driver named Petty Casey, who considered himself Dorothea's friend, would drive her to buy cement, plants, and soil. He took her to bars around Sacramento. He noticed the smell once and asked about it. She told him it was dead rats. He accepted it and never asked again. A former tenant named Homer Myers testified that Dorothea once asked him to dig a 4-foot-deep hole in the backyard, telling him she wanted to plant a small apricot tree. He dug the hole. It was only later, after the bodies were discovered, that Homer realized he may have been digging a grave. He also came to suspect that the next grave might have been intended for him. When he refused to sign over documents giving Dorothea access to his Social Security benefits, she threw him out of the boarding house. That refusal may have saved his life. One detail from this period remains unresolved to this day. Multiple sources report that during the Christmas holidays, Dorothea would share cooked meat with her neighbors as gifts. After the bodies were discovered, some neighbors raised a disturbing question about the origin of that meat. Investigators were never able to confirm or deny whether it was connected to the crimes. The question was raised, documented, and left unanswered. Dorothea Puente's boarding house was not a hidden dungeon. It was a white Victorian home on a tree-lined street, decorated for Christmas, visited by social workers, inspected by parole officers, and known to every neighbor on the block. The people inside it were not invisible because they were hidden. They were invisible because they were old. Because they were old. Because they were mentally ill. Because they were addicted. Because the systems designed to protect them treated them as problems to be placed somewhere, anywhere, rather than as people to be watched over. Dorothea understood this better than anyone. She built her entire operation on a single insight: that no one pays attention to people society has already decided not to care about. And that is what makes the story of the grandmother next door so much more than a crime story. It is a story about what happens when an entire community, the police, the social workers, the parole system, the neighbors, the government, chooses to see what is comfortable rather than what is true. While Sacramento was reeling from the horror of what had been unearthed at 1426 F Street, Dorothea Puente was 6 hours south in Los Angeles, sitting in a motel room at the Royal Viking, watching herself on television. News broadcasts were running her photograph around the clock. Reporters described her as the death house landlady, the grandmotherly serial killer, the sweet old woman who buried bodies in her backyard. By November 13, 1988, the Sacramento Police Department had issued an all-points bulletin. Her face was on every major network. And Dorothea Puente, alone in a rented room with $3,000 in her purse, watched it all unfold. But here is what is remarkable. She did not panic. She did not hide. She did not try to flee the country or change her appearance in any significant way. Instead, she did what she had done her entire life. She walked into a bar and started looking for someone to trust her. On the afternoon of November 15, 1988, a 59-year-old retired carpenter named Charles Wilgues was nursing a beer at the Monte Carlo Tavern, a small bar in downtown Los Angeles, just a short walk from his apartment. He lived alone. He had been to a hardware store earlier that day to buy a glass cutter. It was a normal afternoon. Then the door opened and a woman walked in. She was gray-haired, well-dressed, and wearing a red pleated skirt with matching red high heels. She carried herself with a certain dignity, the kind of woman who looked like she had once been someone important. She sat at the far end of the bar and ordered a screwdriver, vodka, and orange juice. Charles, being friendly, called down to her with a small warning. He told her the heat from the refrigerator motor vented right where she was sitting. The woman thanked him and moved to the stool beside his. She introduced herself as Donna Johansson. She said she was 55 years old. She said she had just arrived in Los Angeles from Sacramento. Her husband, she explained, had recently passed away and she had come south to start a new life. She was looking for a fresh beginning. Charles felt sympathy for her. She seemed refined but down on her luck. She told him that the taxi driver who had dropped her at the Royal Viking Motel had stolen her luggage. She showed him a pair of shoes with a broken heel. Charles, a kind man by nature, took her shoes across the street to a cobbler and had them repaired. When he returned, the conversation continued. Donna was warm, engaging, and attentive. She asked Charles questions about his life, and then, almost casually, she asked the question that Dorothea Puente had asked dozens of people before him. "How much do you receive from Social Security each month?" Charles told her, "Roughly $500 a month." What happened next should have been a warning, but in the moment, it felt like nothing more than an unusual suggestion from a lonely woman. Donna told him they should live together. She said she was an excellent cook. She said they could take care of each other. Charles found the proposal strange, but he did not say so. He simply finished his beer and told her he already had everything he needed. They spent a few more hours together. They went to a nearby hotel. They made plans to meet the following day. And then they parted ways. That night, Charles Wilg went home, sat down in his apartment, and turned on the television. The evening news was dominated by a single story. A boarding house in Sacramento, 7 bodies in a backyard. And the face of the woman police were searching for, a 60-year-old grandmother named Dorothea Puente. Charles felt the blood drain from his body. The woman on the television screen was the woman he had spent the entire afternoon with, the woman who had asked about his Social Security, the woman who had suggested they move in together. Donna Johansson was Dorothea Puente. He later said in an interview that he felt lucky to be alive, that if he had accepted her offer, if he had invited her into his home, he might have ended up the same way as the others, buried in a yard somewhere, forgotten. Charles did not call the police directly. He called a local CBS television station and spoke with a journalist named Gene Silver. Silver immediately recognized the significance. He drove to Charles's apartment. The two of them contacted the Los Angeles Police Department. Within hours, officers surrounded the Royal Viking Motel. On November 16, 1988, 5 days after she had walked away from a garden full of graves, Dorothea Puente was arrested in Los Angeles. The following morning, she was escorted onto a flight from the Hollywood Burbank Airport back to Sacramento. Detective John Cabrera sat beside her. During the flight, Dorothea spoke. She told the detective that she had never killed anyone. When Cabrera asked about the checks, the forged signatures, the stolen benefits from dead tenants, she offered only one response. She said that long before any of this happened, she had been a good person. She was booked into the Sacramento County Jail and formally charged with the murder of Alvaro Montoya. In the months that followed, the charges would grow to 9 counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstances qualifying the case for the death penalty. Dorothea Puente had been caught, but the performance was far from over. The most elaborate act of her life was about to begin. Inside a courtroom, Preparing the case against Dorothea Puente took more than 4 years. Investigators, prosecutors, and forensic specialists worked to piece together the evidence from the boarding house, the backyard, the forged documents, and the testimonies of dozens of witnesses. On March 31, 1989, an amended complaint was filed, charging Dorothea with 9 counts of murder with special circumstances. She pleaded not guilty to all charges. By May of 1990, the prosecution had called 71 witnesses and introduced 108 exhibits during the preliminary hearing alone. On June 19, 1990, a judge ruled there was ample circumstantial evidence to proceed to trial. But finding an impartial jury in Sacramento proved impossible. The case had received so much media coverage that virtually every resident of the city had already formed an opinion. The trial was moved to Monterey County, nearly 200 miles away. Jury selection took weeks. 12 jurors, 8 men and 4 women, were seated on December 21, 1992. 6 alternates were added the following month, and on February 9, 1993, the trial of Dorothea Puente officially began. From the very first day, Dorothea's appearance was a calculated performance. She arrived each morning dressed in flowered frocks, pearls around her neck, her hair styled in the fashion of an elderly matron. She sat quietly, folded her hands, and maintained the demeanor of a woman who could not possibly be guilty of what she was accused of. She was still wearing the mask, and she was betting everything on the hope that the jury would see the grandmother, not the killer. The prosecution was led by Sacramento homicide supervisor John O'Mara. His strategy was straightforward and devastating. He presented Dorothea Puente as a calculating predator who had deliberately targeted people with no family, no friends, and no one who would ask questions when they disappeared. He argued that she drugged her victims using a combination of prescription medications and over-the-counter sedatives, waited for them to die, and then buried their bodies in her yard before cashing their government checks. Over the course of 5 months, O'Mara called 156 witnesses to the stand. More than 3,100 pieces of evidence were submitted. Over 22,000 pages of transcript were recorded. The prosecution built a model of the Victorian boarding house so the jurors could visualize the cramped rooms, the narrow hallways, and the backyard where the bodies were found. They displayed photographs of the victims, first in life, smiling, human, alive. Then the photographs of what was pulled from the earth. The contrast was designed to make the jury feel the weight of what had been done. Among the most critical witnesses was Ismael Carrasco Flores, the handyman who had built the wooden box used to dispose of Everson Gilmouth's body. Flores had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. He told the jury how Dorothea had hired him to construct the box, how she had given him Gilmouth's truck as partial payment, and how he had helped her dump the sealed container by the Sacramento River without knowing what was inside. A handwriting expert testified that Dorothea had forged the signatures of 7 dead tenants on at least 60 government checks. The checks had been mailed directly to the boarding house, generating approximately $5,000 per month in stolen income. Homer Myers, the former tenant who had been asked to dig holes in the backyard, took the stand. He told the jury about the 4-foot-deep hole Dorothea had asked him to dig, saying she wanted to plant a small apricot tree. He told them about the day he refused to sign documents giving Dorothea control of his Social Security benefits. And he told them that after he refused, she packed his belongings into a box and threw it onto the sidewalk. Homer Myers believed that refusal saved his life. An employee from a Sacramento detoxification center testified that Alvaro Montoya had reported that Dorothea was giving him a bitter-tasting medicine. When the employee confronted Dorothea about it, she became angry and threatened to remove Montoya from the boarding house. The employee backed down. Within months, Montoya was dead. Carol Durning, A friend of victim James Gallup testified that Gallup had told her Dorothea was giving him medication that made him sleep for abnormally long periods. He was worried. He said something to someone who could hear him, but nobody did anything. The defense was led by state-appointed attorneys Kevin Climo and Peter Vloton III. They faced an almost impossible task. The evidence of theft was overwhelming and undeniable. Their strategy, therefore, was to concede the fraud and fight the murder charges. Climo told the jury that Dorothea was, without question, a thief. She had stolen from her tenants, she had forged their checks, she had lied to everyone around her. But, he argued, being a thief did not make her a killer. He presented her as a flawed but ultimately caring woman who had taken in people that society had rejected. He suggested that the tenants had died of natural causes, that their advanced age, alcoholism, and poor health had simply caught up with them, and that Dorothea's failure to report the deaths was motivated not by guilt, but by a fear that her parole would be revoked if authorities discovered she was running a boarding house. It was a clever argument, and it exploited the prosecution's one major weakness. Pathologists had been unable to determine a definitive cause of death for any of the 7 bodies recovered from the yard. The remains were too badly decomposed. While toxicology reports confirmed the presence of multiple sedatives and medications in each victim's system, including fluorazepam, which was found in all 7 bodies, the prosecution could not prove with absolute certainty how the drugs had been administered or that the drugs alone had been the direct cause of death. The prosecution countered with expert testimony. A toxicologist explained that while the individual medications found in the victims' bodies were not necessarily lethal on their own, the combination of these drugs, particularly when mixed with alcohol, which many of the tenants consumed regularly, could be fatal, especially in elderly or physically compromised individuals. In Alvaro Montoya's case, carbamazepine was found in his system despite no prescription for it. Someone had added it without medical authorization. But reasonable doubt is a powerful thing, and a grandmother in a flowered dress is difficult to convict of murder, even with a backyard full of bodies. During the trial, the judge invited the jury to visit key locations connected to the case. They were taken to 1426 F Street. They walked through the small rooms where tenants had been given sedatives disguised as medicine. They stood in the backyard where 7 bodies had been buried in a space so confined that investigators had marveled at how Dorothea had managed it. They visited the bars where she had met and recruited her victims. One juror, Joe Martin, later described the experience. He said that walking through the backyard gave him a deep sense of unease. He said there was a heaviness in the air, as though the ground itself remembered what had happened there. The jury deliberated for 35 days. On August 2, 1993, they informed Judge Michael J. Verga that they were deadlocked on all 9 counts. The judge instructed them to continue. 3.5 weeks later, on August 26th, the verdicts were returned. Dorothea Puente was found guilty of the first-degree murders of Dorothy Miller and Benjamin Fink. She was found guilty of the second-degree murder of Leona Carpenter. On these 3 counts, the evidence had been strong enough to overcome the defense's argument. But on the remaining 6 counts, Ruth Monroe, Everson Gilmouth, Betty Palmer, James Gallup, Vera Faye Martin, and Alvaro Montoya, the jury could not reach a unanimous decision. The judge declared a mistrial on those charges. The partial verdict frustrated many who had followed the case. The evidence, they believed, was sufficient for conviction on all counts, but the defense had succeeded in planting just enough doubt, aided perhaps by the image of a frail old woman in pearls who simply did not look like a serial killer. The penalty phase followed. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. But once again, the jury deadlocked. On October 13, 1993, Dorothea Puente was spared execution. On December 10, 1993, at the age of 64, Dorothea Helen Puente was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was transferred to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. the largest women's prison in the United States. In prison, Dorothea maintained the same performance she had given in the courtroom. She insisted she was innocent. She told interviewers that every person found buried in her backyard had died of natural causes and that she had nothing to do with their deaths. She said that her tenants had been in the best health of their lives while under her care. She claimed she had made them bathe daily, change their clothes, and eat 3 meals a day. In 1998, she began corresponding with a writer named Shane Bugbee. The result, published in 2004, was a book titled Cooking with a Serial Killer. It contained a lengthy interview, nearly 50 recipes, and pieces of prison art created by Dorothea. Even behind bars, the grandmother persona endured. In 1997, an appellate court affirmed her murder convictions, but ordered an examination of juror misconduct allegations. After a 3-day hearing in 1998, a judge rejected every allegation. The convictions stood. On March 27, 2011, Dorothea Helen Puente died in prison of natural causes related to old age. She was 82 years old. She never confessed. She never apologized. She never acknowledged the lives she had taken. To the very end, she wore the mask. The story of Dorothea Puente is not the story of a monster hiding in the darkness. It is far more unsettling than that, because Dorothea Puente did not hide. She stood in plain sight. She decorated her fence with Christmas lights. She planted roses above the dead. She smiled at the social workers who brought her new victims. She served meals to the neighbors who smelled the decay and chose to believe it was fertilizer. She was not the stranger in the alley. She was the grandmother next door.